Hello all. Tonight I want to talk about not a movie, but one of my favorite science fiction TV shows, which I'm playing the main theme for right now. And if you don't know, that's the theme from Gerry Anderson's UFO, his first live action TV series. I'm just going to let it play. A little background on Gerry Anderson and why I like the show so much. Sorry about that. When I was growing up in the 1960s, and I was around 7 or 8 in 1966, 67, there weren't really many mature science fiction TV shows on American television. There were a lot of things like Lost in Space and The Time Tunnel and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which I always thought were kind of stupid, and they were rather dumbed down and aimed at kids. They didn't really take their subject matter all that seriously, which is okay. I mean, I guess they weren't meant to be taken that seriously. They were still entertaining, but I was looking for something a little different, a little more intellectual, even at that age. And until Star Trek in 1966 and The Invaders in 1967, there really wasn't much on American TV. However, we had the advantage of getting some good British TV shows, most of which were directed by Gerry Anderson. My favorite and the first one that I saw was Fireball XL5, which was the adventures of Steve Zodiac and his space adventurer and his companion Venus, who was a doctor of space medicine, his friend Dr. Professor Matthew Maddock, who was kind of a mad genius, Robert the Robot, who was his co-pilot, who was voiced by Gerry Anderson, and Zuni, who was Venus's pet, who was an alien called a Lazoon, who could repeat things after he heard them, like, "Howdy, folks," and "Welcome home." And he liked to drive Robert crazy by repeating the phrases over and over again until Robert literally blew his stack and smoke would start coming out of his head, which I thought was very funny as a boy. But they had some good plots. It was interesting. It was well done, well directed. The special effects were by Derek Meddings, who later went on to do the special effects for many James Bond movies and also both Superman 1 and 2 and Tim Burton's Batman as well in 1989. And a number of other TV shows and movies, uh, along with his assistant Mike Trim, who was a great designer who worked on UFO and most of the vehicles. Uh, but I'm getting ahead of myself. After Fireball XL5, which was in black and white, Gerry Anderson, we got the first color TV series from Gerry Anderson, which was in this process he referred to as supermarionation. What that was recording the voice actors' voices on tape and then syncing it with the lip movements of the puppets so that the words came out sounding very real, like they were actually saying them. They also did some clever things, like whenever one of the puppets would open a door or open a letter or fire a gun, they'd show a real person's hand, so it looked more realistic that way. Um, Unfortunately, at the beginning, because the mechanism for syncing the words was large, they had to make the puppets' heads larger proportionally than their bodies, and that looked a bit awkward in the Thunderbirds and Fireball XL5. By the time of his third series, Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, he had perfected a miniaturized device which uh, meant that he could build marionettes that were proportional, both head and body, and looked much more human. Some people kind of freaked out at that. I thought it was great. I thought they looked much more human, and I liked them. And the Thunderbirds was great. It was based on secret organization called International Rescue. That whenever there was a disaster, they'd rush to it, and they had these great spaceships named the Thunderbirds. Thunderbird 1 was a rocket. Thunderbird 2 was sort of a vertical takeoff jet that held a pod that could hold either Thunderbird 4, which was a submarine, a little one, or any number of other vehicles. Thunderbird 3 was a different kind of a rocket, and Thunderbird 4, as I mentioned, was this mini submarine. And I think it could fire missiles and do all sorts of cool things. Um, but it wasn't really about violence. It was about saving people. It was really well done. Again, Derek Meddings did the special effects, and Barry Gray did the theme, the march from the Thunderbirds. Barry Gray wrote pretty much all the music for Gerry Anderson's shows. Um, the third one, which I really liked, was Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons. It was very dark. It wasn't like the Thunderbirds at all. The premise was a expedition is sent to Mars in the year 2063 to find out the source of some mysterious radio signals that they've been receiving on Earth. And they send members of a secret organization known as Spectrum, all of whose agents and operatives are given color-coded names, like Paul Metcalf is called Captain Scarlet, and Jason Turner is called Captain Black. Adam Svensson is Captain Blue. There's Ian McDonald, I think, is Captain Magenta, and so on. And led by a guy named Colonel White. I don't think they ever said what his real name was. It's supposed to be secret, I guess. They operate from a really cool sort of floating aircraft carrier called this Cloud Base. And this was before the Shield helicarrier in Marvel Comics and any other floating aircraft carriers that are in science fiction movies and things. Cloud Base preceded them all. And Cloud Base could launch the Angel interceptors, which were all flown by female fighter pilots, each of whom was based on an actual actress. Like they're led by Symphony Angel, who is supposed to look a bit like Ursula Andress, a tall blonde. The Destiny Angel was British, and I don't remember who she was supposed to be like. I think she was supposed to look kind of like Liz Turner, the lady who did her voice. There was Melody Angel, who was based on Sai Chan, a Chinese actress. Harmony Angel was black. And finally, there was my favorite, Rhapsody Angel, was based on Jean Shrimpton, a very beautiful redhead supermodel, really one of the first supermodels. Also the person who is credited with inventing the mini skirt. She wore a very short tennis dress that came up over her knee for a perfume commercial, and hundreds of women called into the company, and they wanted to know not about the perfume, but where they could get the dress. So she capitalized on that and sold quite a few of them. She was referred to as the most beautiful girl in the world, and at the time I really think she was. And they could launch and attempt to intercept the Mysterons as they were trying to destroy the Earth. But anyway, what happens is on this mission, Captain Black and Captain Scarlet are in this Mars exploration vehicle. They're looking for the source of this radio signal, and they can't find it. And finally, they're going to give up. And over the next rise, they see a mysterious alien city. The aliens are invisible, and they see the Earthmen and say, oh, here are some other people who are curious about life in the universe. Let's take a closer look at them. And they start to train their telescope on the Mars exploration vehicle. Captain Black mistakenly thinks the telescope is a weapon and that they're going to fire on him, and he decides to fire first, which is a big mistake. He destroys their city completely, but unbeknownst to him, the Mysterons have the power of retrometabolism. They can recreate matter. They call it reversing matter. And they recreate their city, and now they've declared that they're going to declare war on Earth because they were attacked unprovoked, and they take over Captain Black and Captain Scarlet. They're going to use them as agents to assassinate the world president, but at the last minute, Captain Blue intercepts Captain Scarlet and shoots him off the top of the Sky Park in London, and he ostensibly dies. However, he actually recovers, and when he recovers, he is now free of the Mysteron influence, and he's virtually indestructible, so he becomes their principal weapon in this quote-unquote war of nerves with the Mysterons, where each week they try to do something terrible, and the Spectrum organization has to stop them. It was very interesting. It was well done. It was dark. Again, special effects by Derek Meddings, soundtrack by Barry Gray. Some of the voices included Ed Bishop and Liz Turner. I think George Sewell did one of the voices as well. And these were people who would go on to be in UFO. and really, very well done. I really enjoyed that one. I still do. I still like to rewatch the episodes. Uh, After that came, I believe, Supercar, which is about a car that could basically do anything. It could fly. It was a submarine. It could, go over land. It was kind of like a tank. It had all these weapons. That was a little bit silly and had like a dumb kind of a chimp character, and the little boy was the main, uh, the hero. That was good, and they had like some interesting adventures, but I never really got into that. After that came Stingray, which was a very good series about a futuristic submarine, again designed by Derek Meddings. Some cool model shots, some interesting themes, a little bit more adult than Supercar. After that Stingray came a series called Joe 90, which is about a boy who could become different people through the use of a very sophisticated computer that his father had invented. And each week he would become a different person. They'd have a different adventure. Some of those were a bit dark too. Sometimes he'd become like an assassin, which was kind of scary because he was a little boy. But after that, Anderson did one more puppet show called The Secret Service. It was about ostensibly a priest who was really a secret agent, and whenever he was questioned, he would talk in gobbledygook, so people couldn't understand him. People didn't like that for some reason. It didn't go over very well. Gerry Anderson and his wife Sylvia, who was his co-producer, and also played a lot of the characters. Like in Thunderbird, she played Lady Penelope, who was sort of a very cool upper-class British lady who was sort of a secret agent, had a really terrific car called Fab One. And FAB was a phrase they used. They never explained what that meant, but apparently it meant Federal Agents Bureau, which was the agency that oversaw international rescue. Um, and she had a very funny butler called Parker, who talked in sort of a snooty accent, which was actually based on a bartender that Anderson knew. And he didn't mind. He didn't mind that he used him for the character. Finally, he decided he wanted to do live action. The first thing he did was a movie, not a TV series, called Journey to the Far Side of the Sun, starring Roy Finnis and his actual wife, Lynn Loring, Herbert Lom, and Ian Hendry, and again, George Sewell, Ed Bishop, Keith Alexander, all of whom were in UFO. Vladek Scheibel was also in UFO. Lonnie von Friedel. And it was a story about scientists discover a planet on the other side of our sun that using a sun probe they saw some weird perturbation on the sun, and it was caused by they figured a planet, and they want to send an expedition. At first they're members of a European space agency called Eurosec. They're sort of a precursor to ESA, but they are turned down mainly by NASA, who is asked to put up some more of the money, and Ed Bishop plays the NASA liaison, and is pretty good with his real hair color. In UFO, they put a blonde wig on him for some reason, but he really had brown hair. But finally, they decide that they find that there's a spy in the organization, and by exposing the spy and killing him and exposing this very sophisticated camera that he actually had inside his eye, and he would go like this and it would take photographs. It kind of frightens the Americans into thinking, well, maybe the Russians have this info too, so maybe we ought to go ahead and fund this space expedition. But they want the best astronaut and the best they insist that it be an American, and that's Roy Finnis's character of an astronaut called Glenn Cook. And the British want a British person too. They want an astrophysicist in case they find something on the other planet that really needs more of a scientific mind to look at, and that's Ian Hendry. And he plays a character called John Kane. Kane is not an astronaut. He's not trained, and they have to put him through, the centrifuge and the rocket sled and all these torturous tests to make him ready for this mission, and they show that in some detail. It's really kind of very stressful on him, but he's going to go anyway. And what they're going to do is they're going to put them to sleep for 3 weeks while they're on the mission to the planet, and then they'll wake them up. They'll go there, they'll explore it if they need to. They have a lifting body, which is kind of a precursor to the shuttle, and they can explore the planet using that. if they decide that it's inhabited or interesting enough to explore. And then they can come back and they'll go into hibernation for another 3 weeks while they come back to Earth. Well, something goes wrong. They do find the planet and they do a survey and they decide they're going to land. There doesn't appear to be any intelligent life, and they crash, and their spaceship is destroyed. Kane is very badly injured, burned really horribly. Um, Cook is not so badly injured, and they're rescued by what appears to be an alien, but it's actually just a Chinese agent from Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And they take them back to Eurosec and start, as soon as Roy Thinnes is recovered well enough, they start to interrogate him. George Sewell and Ilani Friedel, who are the security officers, Ilani von Friedel, sorry, who are the security officers in the Eurosec organization, start to question they keep asking him, why'd you turn back? He said, I didn't turn back. They said, but you were only gone for 3 weeks. And the mission was supposed to take 6 weeks. So either something went wrong or you turned back. And the evidence seems to indicate that they turned back. But there's something they're not really telling Cook. And Jason King, the Herbert Lom's character, who's the head of Eurosec, suspects that there's something wrong, but he thinks it's just a computer error. They don't tell you what that is at the beginning, but they send him home, Roy Thinnes that is, and he goes home and immediately starts seeing things are backward. The light switch in his bedroom is on the opposite side of the wall. All the pictures are wrong. They're not where they were. His wife thinks he's going crazy because he tells her that like the perfume bottles are spelled backwards, and then when he holds them up to a mirror, he can read them forward. And everything seems to be that way. His watch seems to be backwards. His identification is like backwards. It goes from right to left instead of left to right. And he can only read it when he holds it up to a mirror. So she calls in, a psychiatrist, and they come and take him away. And then they give him an experimental drug, which is supposed to, I guess, break down what happened in his mind. And you see it through some various flashbacks and things. But they can't prove that what he says isn't true. Eventually he comes to the conclusion that he's not the same, he's not on the Earth that he left. He did make it to the other planet. He's now on the reverse planet on the opposite side of the sun, where there's an identical duplicate of every person he knew, but they're not the same. And his duplicate, in the meantime, went to the other Earth. And he convinces Jason King of this through various arguments. King finally admits that when John Kane died, they did his autopsy, and his organs were all on the wrong side of the body for their knowledge. So they're going to allow him to go and try and dock with the mothership, which is called the Phoenix, and see if he can recover the flight data recorded, because that will prove his theory that he made it. And he's worried that maybe the electrical systems won't mate because maybe they're backwards. Maybe negative is positive, positive is negative, and something will go wrong. But he has to do it anyway, and they send him up, and he goes, and something goes where he does mate with the ship, but suddenly it's retro rockets fire, and he's launched back out of the back end of the ship. He loses control of the lifting buddy, and they have him on an automatic flight program. He keeps telling him, kill the automatic flight program. I can't break out of this dive, and I'm going to burn up in the atmosphere. Well, they don't hear him. His radio's gone dead. And unfortunately for him, the Phoenix burns up in the atmosphere, but his shuttle crashes into Eurosec and explodes. He's killed, and Eurosec is completely destroyed, except for Jason King, who is now an old, terribly crippled, and he's in a wheelchair, and he's in the hospital, and I won't spoil the ending, but there's kind of a cool ending. I've always thought of Journey to the Far Side of the Sun as a quote-unquote pencil test for UFO, and for those not familiar, pencil test is an animation term. It refers to a rough series of usually black and white animation cells that are only meant to prove the concept. They're not final. They can be in color. There's a really good color pencil test for John Carter of Mars that was done by Bob Clampett, of all people. And if you haven't seen it, it's available online. Go see it. It's really cool. Unfortunately, they decided not to make the movie, and they didn't go ahead with it. But anyway, I think the reason I think of Journey to the Far Side of the Sun as a pencil test for UFO is they used many of the same vehicles, including the Jeeps that became the Shadow Jeeps, the futuristic cars, which became Paul Foster's car and Ed Straker's car in UFO. There's a dress that's worn by Lonnie Von Friedel, which is worn, which was teal with sort of mauve sleeve accents and matching boots. And those boots and that dress were reworn several times on UFO. First by Jane Merrow in the responsibility seat, and I don't know how she fit into it because she's quite a bit more buxom than Lonnie Von Friedel was. But and also by Linda Simpson in the Psycho Bombs, wore the same exact dress. It looked good on all of them. I have to say that. Anyway, UFO takes place in a fictional 1970. Starts with an episode called Identified that was written by Gerry and Sylvia Anderson and their producer Rich Hill. You see these kids in the woods, and there's a landed UFO, and they're filming it with a like an 8mm camera, and all of a sudden an alien appears. He's dressed in a red spacesuit with sort of silver chains, and he has a very sophisticated mini machine gun, and he fires and kills one of them and wounds another one, who's Peter Carlin, who ends up being a member of Shadow. And I'll explain about that in a minute. And then his sister, Layla, is kidnapped. And the last thing you see is her scream, and the scream morphs into the sound of a jet engine landing at a small airfield. And aboard this Learjet are American Air Force intelligence officer Ed Straker and his immediate commander, General Henderson, played by Grant Taylor. And they are escorted to a limousine that has a cabinet minister in it, and I guess ostensibly the Minister of Aviation. And they show him the still footage and frames from the amateur film of the UFO, which they found undeveloped in the camera. So it's incontrovertible evidence. Nobody could possibly have tampered with it. They're going to a meeting with the Prime Minister to discuss what to do about this, when their limousine is attacked by a UFO that fires its energy weapon at them and kills the escorts, and the limousine explodes and it goes off the road. The cabinet minister is killed. Both Straker and Henderson are very badly injured. It now morphs to 10 years in the future. An organization called Shadow, and that's SHADO, which stands for Supreme Headquarters Alien Defense Organization, has been established. It's 80 feet below a film studio, which is run by Straker, called Harlington Straker Studios. He's both the head of the film studio and the commander-in-chief of Shadow. They are now almost operational. They've set up this base. They have a moon base with 3 interceptors that can each launch a nuclear-tipped missile. They have a satellite called SID, for Space Intruder Detector, that can detect UFOs traveling even at faster than the speed of light, but they can't intercept them because they travel faster than the speed of light. And they need something called the Utronics equipment. Well, this equipment is being ferried from New York to London on an SST flown by Colonel Alec Freeman, played by George Sewell, who is Straker's second in command. And the inventor of this equipment is a very beautiful blonde scientist named Virginia Lake, played by Wanda Ventham, who is Benedict Cumberbatch's mom, by the way. And they're flying it out to, like I said, to London. Freeman kind of flirts with Wanda Ventham, which is interesting because later on in the series she actually supplants him, she becomes Colonel Virginia Lake, and becomes Straker's second in command. The reason for that wasn't a writing thing. It was because George Sewell had a commitment to another series, and when they broke production after the first 13 episodes, and they had to move from Borehamwood Wood to Pinewood Studios, he couldn't come. He was committed to this second series, which I think was called The Protectors. I think that was also done by Gerry Anderson, but he couldn't do both of them at the same time. So Wanda Ventham replaced him. But anyway, in this story, that hasn't happened yet, and he's kind of being flirty with her. She makes a couple of cheeky kind of remarks back, and then the SST is targeted by a UFO, because obviously the aliens don't want Shadow to have this Utronics equipment to be able to track them at faster than light speeds. So UFO starts to attack them. They dive into a cloud bank, and fortunately, they also have this fleet of submarines that can launch fighters called the Skydivers. And the jet called Sky 1 closes in on the UFO and destroys it. It crashes into the sea, and a body comes up. And this is the first time Shadow has actually been able to examine one of the aliens' bodies. Because the UFOs, apparently after 48 hours in Earth's atmosphere, they disintegrate, they explode. So they have one now. They rush it to Shadow Medical, and they're doing some preliminary tests. They discover that he's been breathing a liquid which is green, and it has tinted his skin green, though it's not green by nature. He also has a bioacrophilic compound in his hair, which is sort of reddish, and that protects him from this liquid. He has gills, so he can breathe the liquid, and they find shells on his eyes, which they remove, and then his eyes look perfectly human. Those are also to protect from the liquid. They want to interrogate him, but he's very badly injured, and their chief medical officer, Dr. Jackson, played by the wonderful Polish actor Władek Szybal, who you probably know as a Bond villain from Russia with Love, plays Dr. Jackson, and he tells him, well, I have this drug, but it's experimental, and it could be very dangerous. It could kill him. And Stryker says, well, you have to use it. We have to be able to interrogate them. We have to find out why they're here and, what they're doing. And so he gives them the drug, and the alien starts to kind of come out of it, but he doesn't quite gain consciousness. And Stryker says, well, the minute he's conscious, let me know. And he goes off to deal with something else. And a few hours later, one of the nurses calls him and says there's an emergency, and he rushes to the medical center, and the alien has died. He suddenly aged very, very rapidly into an old man, and he just died. When they do the autopsy, they find something shocking. The alien has Layla Carlin's heart, the girl who was in the first scene. And now they realize that the aliens are coming here to use human bodies as organ transplants. They're close enough biologically to us that they can do this. They're apparently sterile. Their planet is probably dying. Their civilization is dying, and they're desperate, and that's why again, this is conjecture, but they think that's why they're coming here. It's a rather dark purpose. And the final scene is Stryker has to tell Captain Carlin, who was the pilot of Skydiver, that his sister died, and that the heart that was in the alien was transplanted from her. And the last thing you see is a funeral, but it's a funeral without a body, and it's very sad. So that establishes something of the tone of the series. There are a lot of really good episodes. One of my favorites is I think it was broadcast third. It was called Exposed, and it's the story of a test pilot named Paul Foster, and he flies accidentally into an area where a UFO incident is taking place, and even though Shadow warns him off, tells him, veer off, you're entering restricted airspace, he wants to complete this test for his company, and he won't do it. So they have no choice. They have to destroy the UFO. So Sky 1 comes into the picture and shoots down the UFO with its nuclear-tipped missile, and this knocks the jet out of the sky. And Foster is seriously injured. His co-pilot is killed. He wakes up in the hospital. He's temporarily blinded from this crash, and the doctors are talking to him about, what did you see, and what happened. And he tries to tell them. They took pictures of the UFO with their gun camera, and he goes back to his employer, and his employer says, well, I think you need to take a leave of absence. And Foster says, why? And he says, well, you've obviously been under a lot of strain, and I understand, and Mark was killed, and it's not your fault, and you need to take some time off. He doesn't really want to take the time off, but he agrees. And now he starts investigating what happened. He breaks into his boss's office late at night, and he steals the slides of the gun camera footage, and when he looks at them at home, the UFO isn't there. It's been edited out somehow. He's noticed when he was in his boss's office an envelope from Harlington Straker Studios addressed to Ed Straker, not Colonel Straker, Ed Straker. And he's trying to figure this out. What's the connection? The sister of the dead pilot comes to see him, played by the always beautiful Jean Marsh, and says, why'd you kill my brother? And he says, I don't understand what you're saying. She said, oh, you made all this stuff up about seeing a UFO. And he says, no, I didn't. And he starts trying to convince her and telling her, what happened. And she sort of sounds like she's kind of starting to believe him a little bit. She leaves, and a couple of thugs show up and beat the crap out of him, knock his apartment completely apart. And later he's interrogated by Dr. Jackson, who's now playing a investigator with a UFO committee, sort of like MUFON. But he starts, trying to convince Foster that he didn't see anything that was a reflection in his windshield or the planet Venus, or just caused by stress. And he says, no, that's not true. That's not what happened. He won't accept, the idea that anything happened but what he saw. And then he goes back to the apartment. He sees a newspaper article about the accident where the cabinet minister was killed, and he sees Ed Straker's name in there and says Colonel Straker, U.S. Air Force, and he starts going, aha, there's something with this guy. So he goes to the studio, asks to see Straker, and they deny him, and they won't let him see him. And finally he kind of corners him on one of the studio lots and starts, kind of hounding him, what's going on here? And he won't answer him, and he's leading him around the studio. Finally, they're kind of cornered in the building, and he turns a wind machine on him and starts asking him the same kind of questions. Jackson, you saw nothing, and it was just a reflection in the windscreen, and says, oh, you're right, and everybody else is wrong. He says, yeah, that's right, I'm right, I know what I saw. And finally he takes out a gun, he points it on, he shoots at the wall, and the chip comes out of the wall, and he points it at Foster's chest, and he fires, and nothing happens. He's not shot. He says, it's an acoustic gun. It only sets off charges in the wall by sound. And then he takes him down to the Shadow headquarters and says, do you think after the 6-week survival course that'll knock your guts out that, you might want to be part of our organization? He says, yeah, I think I'd like to. And he says, I thought you would. And he shows him an ID badge that also already has his photograph and his ID on it. And so this is how they recruit people into Shadow. I thought that was very good. Colonel Straker is played by Michael Billington, who some of you may have seen as a thug on an episode of The Prisoner. And I think he did a couple of other things before that, some of the Carry On films, I think, too. Very good actor. And he really nailed the role of Paul Foster, one of the best and most memorable characters in the series. One of the things I enjoyed about the show most is that it did not stray from showing the personal cost to Colonel Straker of having to keep this terrible secret. It basically ruined his life. In the episode Confetti Check A-OK, it shows the cost, his marriage to the beautiful Mary, played by the beautiful French-English actress Suzanne Neve, falls apart as he has to spend more and more and more time away from her to set up Shadow and get it operational, make sure everything's in place. She mistakenly thinks that he's having an affair because he's away so often, and hires a private detective who sees him meeting with Gabrielle Drake and some of the other female Shadow operatives, and thinks he's having an affair with one of them, which he's not. But Mary thinks he is. She's meanwhile told him that she's pregnant. They're getting ready for the birth of what's going to be a boy, and she falls down the stairs and almost has a miscarriage. Straker's very upset, and he says to Alec Freeman, Alec, I want to tell her. And Alec says, are you crazy? You know what our security boys are like. If you tell her, you put her life at risk and yours. You can't do it. So he doesn't, and she inevitably comes to the conclusion that he is having an affair, and she files for divorce. So his marriage is destroyed. But it's even worse than that when in the episode A Question of Priorities, it starts out with a UFO landing somewhere in a remote area of Scotland, and an alien emerges, and he sets up what is kind of a radio transmitter in this very small home of a blind woman and her parrot, and Shadow can hear these transmissions, and they come to the conclusion that he wants to give himself up. He's willing to answer their questions. So they have to get over to Scotland and pick him up. They arrange for a transporter from New York to go get him, Then we see a scene of Ed and his son, who is now 5 years old, Johnny, and he's showing him around the studio. He shows him a scene from a movie where there's like a fake murder, and lets him watch it, and then he takes him around on a fire engine. They're driving an antique car, which is actually Bessie from Doctor Who. It's the same car, and they do some other fun things, and he's actually kept him too late. He's kept him later than his visitation allows. Brings him back home. Mary's a little pissed off at him, and her new kind of stodgy husband, John Rutland, doesn't really like him much. And Johnny wants to show Ed this sailboat model that he built, that Ed bought for him. And he says, "Wait here, Dal, I'll get it." And in the meanwhile, Mary comes out and says, "I think you ought to leave." And so Straker starts leaving. Johnny sees him leaving from his window, and he's got the sailboat, and he runs out and says, Dad, wait!" And he's not paying attention, and he's struck by a car coming in the other direction, very seriously wounded. He takes him to the hospital, and the doctor tells him, well, the injuries are pretty bad, but he doesn't react to antibiotics. He seems to be allergic to them. And Ed says, "Oh, that's right. He had that infection when he was a boy. He couldn't take penicillin." He says, "But there's a new antibiotic that's available in the United States." And Mary said, "Well, how can we get that here?" And Ed says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." So he goes off and he diverts the transporter that was coming to Scotland to New York to pick up this antibiotic and bring it to London. Not knowing this, Alec Freeman discovers that the transporter has been diverted, doesn't know who did it, and says, "Gosh darn it, I want that thing in Scotland," and redirects it. Because Straker didn't tell him, he doesn't know how important it is that the transporter get to London. Meanwhile, in Scotland, the alien is preparing to be picked up. He disassembles the little transmitter, and he's standing out in the field, and another UFO shows up and kills him with a laser beam. So that whole thing was moot. Straker then finds out that what Freeman has done with the transporter, orders him to send it back to London as soon as he's quote-unquote done with it. Doesn't give him any details because he doesn't really want him to know that it's personal. And then it gets to London, and it's too late. Johnny has died. And the last thing you see is Suzanne Neve in absolute hysterics and tears, and she says to Ed, "I never want to see you again." Really well done, very well acted, and completely heartbreaking. So not only has he lost his wife, he's lost his son as well. Then it goes even further. He can't really trust his friends either, or his associates. In the excellent episode Kill Straker, which I think was written by Tony Barwick, sorry. Foster and another astronaut are out on a mission, and a UFO intercepts them and hypnotizes them and gives them the mental, subconscious directive, "Kill Straker." And they just say it over and over again until it becomes ingrained into them. The shadow operative is then later seen trying to sabotage a water treatment plant on the moon, which will starve everybody of water. He is stopped at the last minute and killed. They don't understand why he did it. And then just subsequently, he and Paul Foster go to meet with General Henderson, who's now the head of an organization called the International Astronautics Committee, which holds the purse strings over Shadow. And Straker is arguing that he wants 4 new fully automated moon bases, and an expanded skydiver fleet, and more equipment. And Foster says, "I think that's unnecessary, and I think you're, being wasteful." And he says, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I think this should be renamed Straker's Alien Defense Organization. I think you're laying this go to your head." And he says, "What are you saying?" He says, "I'm going to push for a change of command." "Well, who do you have in mind?" He said, "Well, what about me?" And so they get into this big conflict in front of General Henderson, which Straker finds very embarrassing. He dresses Paul down about it, and later he meets with Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson calls him urgently into his office. He says, "What's wrong?" And Alec Freeman says, "Paul Foster's finished." He says, "What do you mean finished?" He says, Jackson says, "Well, when he was out there, he was hypnotized by the aliens and given one very deep hypnotic suggestion, and that was to kill you." He says, "Well, can't you re-hypnotize him and get rid of it?" And he says, "No, it's too deeply ingrained. And, he could be fined for 20 years, and then one day he'll just turn around and strangle you to death." and there's nothing we can do about it. And Freeman's saying, well, you know what that means? There's no retirement from Shadow, i.e. they're going to have to kill him. Straker says, let me take care of it. And he takes Foster down to a shooting range, and he's firing at targets behind him and kind of yelling at him about, having upbraided him in front of General Henderson. He says, you think you're going to take over the organization that took me 10 years to build, you little punk? And he starts, shooting these targets behind him. And he says, how dare you, suggest that, if you're going to push for a change of command, huh? I'll show you. And he keeps, firing these things. And he's getting Foster angrier and angrier and more nervous. Finally, Foster picks up a gun. He goads him. He says, go ahead, kill me. Go ahead, shoot. And he won't do it. He takes the gun, he throws it away. And he says, you tried to kill me. And Straker takes his gun and he shoots every single target in the row and says, if I wanted to kill you, I could have done it at any time. But if you were going to kill me, you would have done it right then. So he got rid of the impulse that way. But again, it's a matter of can he still trust Foster or not. You never really know. And this is further illuminated in the episode, one of my favorites, The Man Who Came Back, with the marvelous actor Darren Nesbitt, who was also a very good number 2 on The Prisoner. The episode opens with a UFO attack, and the interceptors are launched, and they destroy the first 2 UFOs, but the third one veers off, and it fires on SID, Space Intruder Detector, and damages it very badly. So now the satellite is knocked out of commission, which is potentially disastrous for Earth, because now they can't detect UFOs coming around the moon's orbit. They have to repair it. And meanwhile, an astronaut named Craig Collins is heading back towards Earth. He is apparently having a bit of an affair with now Colonel Virginia Lake, who is now on Moonbase. And I should mention, I'm going to divert here for a second. Some people argued that the show was a bit sexist because, for one thing, all the girls on Moonbase, Moonbase was mostly operated by women, which I thought was anything but sexist. It was kind of the reverse. Wear these tight silver cat suits, and they have these purple hair, which kind of predates the rainbow hair thing by quite a number, by 40 years. But Sylvia Anderson just said she thought that looked cool, and it was just her way of presenting a futuristic style that she liked. And there's a famous scene where Gabrielle Drake as Lieutenant Gay Ellis, who's the commander of Moonbase for most of the time, is changing from the longer catsuit, which had pants, into a sort of a miniskirt, and behind a mirror. Other people can't see her, but we, the audience, see her. And it's kind of a sexy scene, and again, might be viewed as a little bit sexist, viewing a girl as an object, but I don't think that was really what was meant by that scene. Anyway, in the episode, Colonel Collins is heading back towards Earth in a spaceship, and another UFO, a smaller one, starts following him. Now they've launched the interceptors, they can't rearm them. Each one only carries one nuclear-tipped missile, and then they have to be rearmed. It takes quite a while, and they don't have time to intercept this UFO that's following him. His ship catches fire somehow and crashes in the jungle on Earth, and he's presumed dead. This upsets Straker because they were astronauts together. He was his friend, but eventually he demands that the file be closed and everybody move on. Well, a couple of months later, Collins is discovered alive in the jungle, but they don't recover his ship. They bring him back to Shadow, and almost immediately people start noticing there's something not quite right about him. His immediate commander, Colonel Gray, who is played by Gary Raymond, says, he tells him he wants to play a game of chess with him. He says, oh, you're a glutton for punishment, huh? You've never beaten me. He says, oh, you want to make it interesting? You want to make it, say, 50? He says, well, it's your money if you want to throw it away. And then Collins mates him in 4 moves. And he thinks that's very strange. Colonel Lake is now dating Paul Foster because she thinks that Collins was dead. And they never had a very, quote-unquote, hot romance to begin with. She says, we were never exactly Romeo and Juliet. He gives her a very passionate kiss and almost starts, becoming, violent. And she pushes him away and says, you didn't leave the jungle, you brought it back with you. And Colonel Gray reports this to Straker. He says, there's something wrong. And Straker says, nonsense. He passed all 3 tests. All 3 of Shadow's doctors cleared him. And The computer cleared him. He says, well, sometimes computers are wrong. And he says, what? Because he beat you at a game of chess, he's psychotic? He says, well, what about Virginia Lake? She thinks he's changed too. And he says, oh, Virginia Lake's just a girl who fell out of love. And don't let your, dislike of him, color your judgment. Um, and, he has to go and repair Sid because he's the only one who's qualified. So they're going to send him up to Moonbase to repair Sid with Colonel Gray is going to be his, commander, but Collins has authority over, what happens to Sid. So he goes up and he tells him, I want Foster to be my assistant. He says, why Foster? He says, well, he's young and I can train him in the time that we have available, which is 2 weeks. And he says, okay, you've got him. He starts training Foster, and then something. They're training, and Foster's getting a little upset, with how hard he's pushing him. He says, "Oh, I know you're getting a little uptight. I know how to work that out. Let's go with some weights." And they're lifting weights, and finally they get to like 250 pounds. He says, "Well, that's my limit. I'm not pushing for the world's bandiest astronaut title." The term "bandy" is British, means well muscled, so he's lifting this 250-pound weights, Collins is, and he starts going over like, oh my god, and he can't hold it, and it hits Foster right in the chest and breaks 2 of his ribs, and now he can't go on the mission. Colonel Gray is furious and says, "What the heck do you think you were doing, you fool? You knocked out the only person who could fly the mission with you." And he said, he's not the only person who can fly the mission with me. He says, "What do you mean? Who else could do it?" And he says, "Ed Straker." He says, "He and I put Sid out there in the first place." And he says, "I don't know. I don't think that's such a good idea." And he brings it up with Straker, and Straker says, "No, he's right. I'm the only one to do it. I have to do it. We got to go." So they start training for this mission. Raymond is not sure. There's a couple of incidents that happen. Like they're on the film set, and an old man walks by, and he says, "Oh, is Mr. Gray? Can you tell me where D stage is?" And he says, "Oh, yes, it's over there." And he says, "Oh, thank you. And who are?" And he starts pointing at Collins, and his cane starts to shake in his hand. And he says to his associate, "Come on, we can't stand around all day." Well, Gray waits a minute, and then he goes back and talks to him. And he says, "Sir Esmond, what happened back there?" He says, "Oh, nothing. It's just one of those things you can't explain, like walking over a grave." He doesn't know that Collins has actually seen him have this conversation. Then he goes to Dr. Jackson and says, "Are you sure that Collins passed all the tests?" And he says, "Well, yes, all the regulation ones." He says, "What do you mean regulation ones?" He says, "Well, I'm working on something, but it's purely theoretical." He says, "What is it?" He says, "Well, I call it an isolator." And he shows him what's basically a sensory deprivation tank, a cabinet where he can put people in it and they're cut off from all outside influence, including cosmic rays. And he says, "Well, what does that prove?" He says, "Well, for most people, when I put them inside the cabinet and when they're outside the cabinet, their brainwaves don't change that much. For instance, here's a colleague," and he shows him a tape, and the brainwaves are pretty much the same. And he says, "But here's Collins," and he shows it to him, and his brainwave outside the isolator is normal, but inside it's just blank. It's a blank line. And he said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "Well, I don't know. It's just, a theory I have, and I've got central computers working on it." He said, "Well, let me know, the minute you find anything. If I'm not here, I'll be at Collins's." And he goes over to Collins to kind of confront him about this. He says, "Did they ever find your ship that crashed?" And he said, "No." He says, "Are you sure you told us where to find it in the right place?" He said, "Well, I could be off by, a mile or two. I don't know." And he says, "You don't remember anything?" He says, "No, it's all very much a blank." He says, "Look, Colonel Jackson did a test on you." He says, "Oh, Jackson does lots of tests." He says, "Yeah, but in this one he placed you in a cabinet." And he says, "Yeah, so what?" He says, "Well, when you were in that cabinet, you were cut off from everything, including radio waves." He says, "Your brain pattern stopped. You were a blank, a body without a will." He says, "Look, I know you've never liked me." He says, "But listen, I think the aliens snatched you out there. They burned out the personality centers of your brain, and they've been controlling you with radio waves." And he says, "Oh, come on, that's ridiculous." He says, "And besides, if it's true, you can't argue with a robot, can you?" And he hits him over the head with what's obviously a plastic rocket model, but he's knocked out anyway, and takes all of his ID from him, and then he leaves to go on this mission with Straker to fix Sid. Fortunately for Colonel Gray, Collins' maid comes, and she knocks on the door, and when he doesn't answer, she opens with a pass key and screams when she sees him bleeding on the carpet. He's taken to the hospital. Meanwhile, he and Collins and Straker launch for Sid on a NASA rocket. They can't use their own, and they reused shot footage from Journey to the Far Side of the Sun. Both the rocket and the lifting body that they used to get to Sid are from that movie. They get there, and just at that time, Gray awakens in the hospital. He demands a telephone. He calls Shadow HQ and lets him know what's going on. Foster warns him, and he says, Collins is going to try to kill you. And he does. He tries to he starts hitting him with his jetpack and his maneuvering rocket pack, and starts trying to strangle him. And he says, Craig, listen, you can beat this thing. They may have gotten your mind, but they can never get your soul. And you hear Gray's voice in his head saying you were a body without a will, and controlling you with radio waves. And you see he's starting to fight it. He's trying to fight this impulse to kill Straker that the aliens have implanted in him. And Straker, meanwhile, grabs his air hose and pulls it out and shoves him away. And he dies. He's killed. And Foster keeps calling him and says, Straker, do you read me? Do you read me? He says, yeah, I read you. He says, Collins could have killed you. Straker says rather sadly, yes, he could have killed me. But of course he didn't. But now he's lost another friend. He can't even really go on a date without worrying about security. In the episode The Responsibility Seat, which again I believe was written by Tony Barwick or Christopher Penfield, I'm not sure, but he is being Straker, as the head of the studio, is being interviewed by a reporter named Joe Fraser. It turns out Joe is short for Josephine, is the beautiful Jane Merrow, who's going to interview him. And he notices early on that she both takes notes and has a recorder inside her purse, because he sees the wires. She says, oh, that's just so that I don't misquote you. She concludes this little interview, which is kind of blasé, and leaves, and quote-unquote accidentally leaves her purse in Straker's office as she's going out to the car. She comes back, and Ms. Eland, his secretary, who's played by Lois Maxwell, who was Moneypenny in a number of James Bond films, stops her and says, hey, you can't go in there. She says, well, I left my purse. She says, oh, I'll get it for you. During the period of time between when she left and when she comes back, Lieutenant Ford, played by Keith Alexander, has called up to Straker. All he says is Commander Straker, but Straker's concerned that even that, if it's leaked to the press, could be disastrous. So he has to go after her and ask her for the tape back. He does. He pursues her to her apartment and demands the tape. Actually hits him over the head with a vase and runs out. And he's not badly hurt, so he goes after her and chases her. She has a very fast car, a Porsche Targa, but he has a special car of his own, and manages to track her down. You think he's going to have her arrested, and instead he says, "You know what I hate most of all?" And she says, "What?" He says, "Eating dinner alone." And he's actually starting to fall for her, and he invites her back to his apartment. It was very bleak since the divorce, and he makes her dinner, offers her some wine. He does not drink himself. That they established that in the first episode. But offers her some wine, and they're starting to get a little romantic. He's playing some music. Meanwhile, he has her talk briefly with Ms. Eland, and asks, when the conversation's over and she's out of the room, he asks Ms. Eland to run a security check on her, what he calls a G7. And a few minutes later, Ms. Eland calls back and tells him basically that she's a con man. She seduces men and has a hidden accomplice take photographs and tries to blackmail them. And so he throws her out. Meanwhile, Alec Freeman has been put in charge of Shadow while he's gone. And on Moonbase, a Russian mining rig has gone out of control, and it's headed directly at Moonbase, and they can't seem to stop it. Paul Foster goes out onto the surface in a Moommobile and fires a couple of warning shots, but the vehicle doesn't stop. He contacts the head of the Russian base and says, "How do you stop this thing?" He says, "Well, there's a device on board that's a kill switch located at the front of the cockpit, and if you throw that, it'll stop the vehicle." And he says, okay, and he tells this to Freeman. Freeman says, "Don't risk it, just put Moonbase on alert and let them know what's going to happen." Well, Foster goes against his orders and actually climbs on board the rig, and he's trying to talk to these Russian miners, but they've contracted anoxia. They're not getting enough oxygen to their brains, and they're acting kind of punch drunk. and singing songs, and they invite him to sing a song with them, and he's playing along, and he's trying to get closer and closer to this switch. Every time he gets near it, one of them pushes him away, but finally he struggles with one of them, and he hits it at the last minute and stops the vehicle inches away from striking Moonbase and puncturing the pressure dome. So he saved Moonbase, but he went against Friedman's orders, which he shouldn't have done. But Stryker goes back and asks Alec, what did you, what did you think of the responsibility seat, being on the other side of the fence? Says, well, I think you made a good decision sending Paul Foster onto that rig. And of course, Friedman didn't send him on the rig; he did it on his own initiative. But he kind of glad hands it like he did do it on purpose. And he says, you handle things much better than I did with that girl. I probably would have gotten emotionally involved. Of course, he doesn't realize that Stryker was getting emotionally involved with the girl before he found out she was a con man. So he can't even really date safely anymore. There are a number of other really good episodes. I'm not going to discuss all of them. There were 26 in all. As I said, there was 13. The first 13 were shot at Boreham Wood in England, and then something happened. They had to relocate the entire set to Pinewood Studios instead. And during that hiatus, a couple of actors left. A couple of new ones went on. And there were some really good episodes in both series. One of the ones that I like because of a premise that it proposes was called The Cat with 10 Lives. It's about an interceptor pilot named Jim Regan, and he's, I guess, kind of stressed out after being on the Moonbase for a long time, and they rotate him back to Earth, and he meets with his wife, the very beautiful Sonia Fox, and they have to go out to a meeting with these friends who are kind of stodgy, and they don't really like them, and they say that something got delivered to their house kind of mysteriously, and it's basically a Ouija board, but just with cards and a glass cup. And they set it up, and they say, why not give it a try? And they're having kind of fun with it. And at first, it's obvious that Regan is kind of playing around. And he asks him if his son is going to be a boy or a girl, and he manipulates it so it points to boy, and he's obviously pushing it. But then something odd happens. A kind of a white light shines on Regan's forehead between his eyes, and he starts acting kind of like he's hypnotized. And the Ouija board spells out seance. And they hold this seance, and he just kind of like goes blank, and they're really kind of freaked out. And his wife says, "I think we should go home now." So they go home, and as they're driving home, he suddenly grabs the wheel away from her and jerks to the left. And she says, "What are you doing?" He says, "There's something in the road." And she says, "What?" And they go out, and there's a cat, and it's a beautiful Siamese cat. It was obviously very frightened by the car. And she says, "Oh, poor thing," was scared by the headlights, and brings it in, and they starts petting it. Says, "Oh, if we don't find the owner, can I keep him?" And he says, "Oh, I knew this kind of thing was going to happen." And as they're continuing, she says, "Do you want me to drive?" He says, "Maybe you better." So she starts driving, and as they're going home, all of a sudden they encounter an alien standing right in the middle of the road. He has a knockout device, and he knocks them both out. When Regan wakes up, his wife is gone. She's been abducted. So he's in a panic. Obviously, goes to Stryker and tells him about it, and he brings the cat with him into Shadow headquarters, and it's kind of looking around, and people are petting it. One of the Shadow operatives was played by Aisha Bro, who had a children's show also, but a very pretty girl, is petting and says, "Oh, you're a nice kitty," and Regan starts developing a headache whenever the cat's around, which everybody thinks is kind of weird. But Stryker decides to ground him. He says, he understands that he's been through a lot of stress, and he doesn't think he should go back on duty, even though he wants to go back to Moonbase. But you see him, lying down, and then all of a sudden you see that white light between his eyes again, and the cat is kind of staring at him when this happens, and he sneaks his way back to Moonbase by tricking one of the security guards into saying that Stryker changed his mind, and he is going up. Stryker's very upset about this. He starts asking about any unusual things, and Aisha mentions the cat. And she says, "Oh, there was a cat, and when it was around, Regan got a headache." All of a sudden, then, Dr. Jackson asks Stryker to come into his office. And he says, "What?" And he says, "You know that alien body that we found this morning?" He says, "Yes." He says, "We've been assuming up to this point that the aliens were humanoid and they were using our bodies for transplants. He says, yeah. He says, but the body that we found this morning, I think was entirely human. He says, even the brain? He says, yes, even the brain, although the centers of the brain that control emotion were erased, and only the logical and the analytical sections remained. And he says, can they do that? And he says, well, yeah, I guess they can, because it appears that they did. So he says, well, what does that mean? He says, well, maybe they can't travel in space. Maybe they need a vessel, our bodies. He says, as strange as they sound, they may be living computers. And if that's not a rather cogent description of AI, and mind you, this is 1969, 1970 that they're saying this, and there was no such thing as AI, that I've never heard one. And again, that was interesting because also 2001: A Space Odyssey was being filmed at Pinewood while they were filming UFO also. HAL obviously is an AI, or at least an intelligent computer, and so was SID apparently. Although SID's function was somewhat limited, but they did imply that it was intelligent. So anyway, later in this episode, he says, well, he asks him, could that be applied to an animal? He says, well, I suppose. And then he gets it. He gets that they did this to this cat. Somehow they have incorporated their mind into a cat, and the cat is controlling Regan. And what they want him to do is to crash his interceptor into Moonbase. And he starts to do it, and then they don't know what they're going to do. And the Straker remembers they were shooting a dog food commercial up on the studio lot. And he brings in the dogs to get the cat and kill it. And when it kills the cat, Straker, the alien's control over Regan breaks, and he pulls his interceptor up at the last minute and crashes, but he's killed. But I thought that was a very good, interesting episode. Again, the whole series is great. There's the great theme music by Barry Gray using the Hammond organ, which was a new instrument at the time, and the models done by Derek Meddings and his assistant Mike Trim were terrific. The Interceptors and Skydiver and the Shadow Mobiles, the Moonmobiles and the lunar modules were all terrific. Very realistic looking for the time. Again, no explosions in space, and the modules were silent when they came down on the moon. And again, very good, very well shot, very interesting, dark but terrific series. One of the other ones I liked, and I think one of the last ones I'm going to discuss, was really dark. It was called The Square Triangle, and starred Adrienne Corey and Patrick Maurer as young lovers who are plotting to kill her rather controlling husband by making it appear that she was actually trying to stop a burglar, that there had been a burglar attempt earlier, and she thought that the burglar had returned and shot her husband by accident. But what happens is a UFO crashes in that area, and when the door opens and she's preparing to fire, it's an alien who comes through, and she kills the alien. And now Shadow has to become involved. Shadow has developed what they call an amnesia drug, and it will erase the memory of the past 72 hours of anyone who takes it. They administer this drug, but Straker's kind of wary because he realizes that not only will it erase their knowledge of the UFO and of Shadow, but it will erase their knowledge of the fact that they failed at the attempt to kill her husband, and he fears that they're going to do it again. He is disgusted and has them thrown out of his office. Of course, they haven't done it, so he can't go to the police. But the last scene you see, instead of the usual pullback shot from the Earth to the Moon and the alien planet, is Adrienne Corey standing in a cemetery at her husband's grave, putting down flowers, and as she walks down the laneway, Patrick Maurer comes out to meet her. So they did it, which I think was really dark and really creepy. Some other episodes I like are Destruction with the beautiful Stephanie Beacham. Very interesting plot, which I won't spoil for you. ESP, which is a really good, interesting episode about a man with extrasensory perception and how it kind of ruins his life and how he intersects with an incident at Shadow. Some really good acting in that one. Terrific writing as well. Time Lash, which is a great science fiction film, and it should be noted that Wanda Ventham wore a very sexy purple pantsuit and top in that, and I think matching boots too in that episode, which were her own. And Sylvia Anderson once asked her, do you still have that purple outfit? And she said, yeah. Well, why don't you wear it for this show? And she said, okay. And she wore it, and to this day, one of them receives letters asking for signed photographs of her in that outfit. So it was quite fetching. Again, a very good, almost a pure science fiction episode. Really cool. Again, I won't spoil it for you. All the episodes, I believe, are available on YouTube or on streaming in various qualities. Some of them are directly from the DVD, which are really good quality. UFO did very well when it was broadcast in the United States, and that prompted them to start production on a second series. One of the reasons it did well is it was shown on Saturday nights before All in the Family, and people would tune in to watch All in the Family, but they'd tune in early and they'd watch UFO. Apparently, Americans liked the episodes that were set entirely on moon base, like Survival and The Responsibility Seat, and to some extent Reflections on the Water, and a few others. So they were going to set the second series entirely on moon base. The premise was the aliens had stopped attacking Earth, and now they were concentrating on this much, much expanded moon base instead. There are going to be new vehicles and new personnel, and this is a greatly expanded plot. Fortunately, after All in the Family went on summer hiatus in 1970, the ratings started to slip, and people weren't watching it anymore. Sir Lou Gray, the head of ITV Television, who made the show, went to Gerry Anderson and Sylvia Anderson and said, no, I want you to make something else. And so what that morphed into, he said, well, we've got all these sets and all these props and everything, costumes. And he said, well, use it on the new series. So he did, and that morphed into Space 1999, which I feel was actually rather an inferior series. I enjoyed it, but I would much rather have had that second series of UFO, which is going to be called UFO 1999 originally. Again, great episodes, terrific show, some interesting styles and costumes. They had a lot of men in these sort of Nehru jackets, which didn't turn out to, as a futuristic look, didn't turn out to be true. They had men with eyeshadow, which also was not a style that was adapted, although maybe it was. Maybe it kind of predicted David Bowie and the goths and things of that sort, just as the Moonbase Girls' purple hair predicted the whole rainbow hair thing a long time prior to it happening. But again, very well worth watching, and I highly recommend it.